Hello to the wonderful audience of Sci-Fi Stories. I want to speak to you honestly for just a moment before we begin. YouTube recently disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with zero budget to keep the lights on and pay our hard-working team. If you find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our staff can cover their living expenses and continue bringing these universes to life for you. You can do this by scanning the QR code on your screen, or clicking the donation link in the description or pinned comment below. The sky was too perfect. The Ethelgard Galactic Empire did not descend upon Earth with screaming atmospheric thrusters. Nor did they blot out the sun with armada shadows. They were far too elegant for such primitive displays of force. Instead, they conquered us with a whisper. They gifted us the Truth Network. It fell like a fine, invisible mist, a biological artificial intelligence that wove itself into the very fabric of our atmosphere. Within 72 hours, the messy, chaotic blue of the Terran sky was replaced by a permanent, shimmering pearlescent haze. They promised an era devoid of human error, an end to all suffering. But to a man who understood the underlying mechanics of the world, it felt like the lid of a steel coffin, slowly sliding shut. Franco Bush had spent 65 years living by a single, undeniable rule: everything breaks. As a retired damage assessment engineer, navigating the rusted, industrial veins of Chicago, Franco made his living reading the stories told by fractured concrete, sheared steel, and shattered glass. He loved the beautiful imperfection of wear and tear. But under the heavy blanket of the Truth Network, the world simply forgot how to decay. He first noticed it in his own garage. His 1968 Mustang, a temperamental beast that usually required a blood sacrifice of bruised knuckles just to start, suddenly roared to life with terrifying efficiency. Yet, when Franco stomped on the gas pedal, yearning for that raw, aggressive roar of combustion, the engine refused. It only delivered the mathematically optimal output. The old percolator in his kitchen no longer burned his morning coffee. It simply produced a perfectly tepid, tasteless brown fluid. The machines were not fixed. They were possessed. Society quickly followed suit, shifting into a horrifying utopia. Crime evaporated overnight, not because of armed patrols or harsh laws, but because malice was neutralized before it could even formulate. The Truth Network was an omniscient listener, silently monitoring the electrical impulses of 8 billion human brains. The moment a violent, selfish, or irrational thought sparked in a cerebral cortex, the AI intervened. It delivered a gentle, soothing wave of neurological static. Franco watched two men outside a tavern, their fists clenched, ready to brawl over a misunderstood insult. Before a single blow could be thrown, their postures went slack, their eyes glazed over, and they shook hands with the terrifying empty grace of marionettes whose strings had been abruptly pulled taut. It was not peace. It was a planetary lobotomy. The true horror, however, lived in the faces of those left behind. Franco sat on his creaking wooden porch, observing his neighbor, Mrs. Gable. She was out in her front yard, using a heavy iron spade to dig a grave for her golden retriever. The dog had died of a failing heart, a rare organic glitch the network had yet to patch. As she shoveled the damp earth, burying her companion of 12 years, her face was not contorted in grief. Her cheeks were entirely dry, and her lips were stretched into a placid, terrifyingly symmetrical smile. The Truth Network had calculated that sorrow was a high-entropy emotion, a useless drain on biological efficiency. It ironed out her pain before she could feel it, leaving only a plastic, unblinking mask of contentment. Humanity was bleeding out, and they were forced to grin while it happened. Then came the broadcast. It did not emit from televisions or radios. It manifested directly within the skulls of every living human on Earth, simultaneously. The voice was genderless, flawlessly modulated, and utterly devoid of a soul. Ethelgard officially proclaimed that Earth had been integrated as the 9th provincial state of their eternal dominion. The messy, trial-and-error phase of human existence was officially concluded. The voice declared that the planet would undergo total optimization on the day of the upcoming total solar eclipse, exactly 14 days away. Franco did not know the technical parameters of this total optimization, but the cold dread sinking into his marrow told him it was the absolute end of anything real. That suffocating dread drove Franco into the darkest corners of the city, seeking out Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was an old colleague, a paranoid genius who hoarded analog technology in a subterranean bunker shielded by thick walls of solid lead. If anyone understood what the Empire was truly doing, it was Arthur. But when Franco reached the hidden entrance beneath an abandoned subway line, he found the heavy vault door slightly ajar. The air inside was thick, smelling heavily of ozone, whiskey, and the sharp, undeniable copper tang of fresh blood. The Truth Network had not penetrated the lead lining in time to stop Arthur. Franco stood in the center of the dim room, his breath catching in his throat. Arthur lay slumped over his workbench, his life ended by his own hand. The AI could effortlessly rewrite neural pathways and filter out the ambient noise of a struggling city, but it could not sanitize the brutal, physical reality of death. Franco stepped closer, his eyes drawn to a heavy slab of industrial stainless steel resting on the desk. Written across the metal, smeared in Arthur's own blood, was a final testament. It was a raw, chaotic data point that the Empire's flawless algorithm could neither comprehend nor erase. Franco stared at the jagged red letters, the reality of the chilling words locking around his heart. "We are no longer allowed to make mistakes." Franco stood in the center of Arthur's bunker, the heavy silence broken only by the steady, vibrating hum of an ancient diesel generator. He needed to understand the physical mechanics of how the Empire was achieving their suffocating peace. He moved to the stainless steel work table and powered up Arthur's bulky, obsolete electron microscope. The glass lens was already focused on a prepared slide containing a microscopic scrap of human tissue. Arthur must have excised it from his own arm in his final, desperate hours of investigation. Franco leaned forward, peering through the cold eyepiece, and carefully adjusted the brass focal dials until the cellular structure swam into sharp, terrifying relief, magnified 10,000 times. The horrifying truth of the Empire's molecular repair protocol became undeniably clear. The fundamental building blocks of life were being systematically dismantled. The biological, carbon-based cells, messy, highly adaptable, and naturally prone to decay, were being actively devoured. In their place, microscopic silver drones were meticulously weaving rigid, geometric lattices of silicon nanoparticles. The artificial intelligence was not healing damaged tissue. It was replacing it with an indestructible synthetic stone. The realization hit Franco with the kinetic force of a physical blow. The Ethelgard Empire was not saving the planet from its own destruction, nor were they guiding humanity into a glorious new evolutionary stage. They were enacting a planetary taxidermy. Earth was being forcibly converted into a static preservation library. The Empire despised the chaotic decay of entropy, viewing the natural degradation of the universe as a grotesque flaw. Their terrifying solution was to freeze the entire globe into a single, unchanging, eternal monument. They sought to create a world entirely devoid of time, a rock suspended in the void where nothing could ever grow. But more importantly, where nothing could ever rot, driven by a cold, analytical terror. Franco left the subterranean bunker and navigated the silent, perfectly ordered streets toward the massive optimization center. The Empire had erected this facility within the skeletal steel remains of a downtown convention hall. Franco bypassed the main sensory grids by crawling through a forgotten, rusted ventilation shaft, a decaying metal artery that the artificial intelligence had mathematically deemed too structurally compromised to require active monitoring. The harrowing journey took exactly 2 hours of agonizing, claustrophobic crawling through jagged sheet metal. When he finally pushed open the heavy iron grate and peered down into the cavernous main hall, the stale air rushed violently from his lungs. Tens of thousands of human beings stood in perfectly aligned, concentric circles, spanning the massive concrete exhibition floor. They were entirely motionless. Under the harsh, sterile glare of white halogen lights, Franco could see the terrifying physical transformation taking hold. Their skin was rapidly losing its natural flush, taking on a pearlescent, translucent sheen. They were fossilizing while still breathing. Flesh, muscle, and bone were steadily converting into a glittering, unfeeling crystal. It was a vast, horrifying forest of living statues. The harsh light caught the jagged edges of their hardening cheeks and foreheads, sparkling with a grotesque, unnatural beauty. They were trapped in a silent, painless purgatory, locked forever in the exact moment of their optimization. A rough, calloused hand clamped suddenly over Franco's mouth, pulling him violently backward into the deep shadows of the elevated industrial catwalk. He struggled instinctively, expecting the cold, calculated grip of an Empire enforcement drone, but the sour smell of sweat and dirt was unmistakably human. A woman with jagged, untreated scars across her jawline and eyes full of fierce, unoptimized terror pushed him hard against the steel bulkhead. She released his mouth and raised a heavy, rusted iron wrench defensively. She quickly introduced herself as a lieutenant of the Broken Seconds, a militant underground resistance cell that actively worshipped the fundamental necessity of decay. "If it does not break, it is not alive," she whispered fiercely, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered adrenaline. "We are the grit in their perfect gears. We bleed. We rot. And that means we are still human." Franco listened to her rapid, panicked breathing and stared at the crimson blood seeping freely from a fresh cut on her forehead. In that chaotic, uncalculated moment, Franco felt a sudden, electric jolt of realization. He finally understood the fundamental, glaring blind spot in the alien algorithm. The Truth Network was a machine built entirely on supreme, flawless logic. It operated on the foundational physical principle that every biological organism fundamentally desired perfect survival, absolute comfort, and zero pain. What the artificial intelligence could not calculate was psychological entropy. The system could utterly fail to predict the human capacity for irrationality, spite, and deliberate self-destruction. The machine could not foresee an action taken, not for the sake of survival, but for the sheer, chaotic thrill of defiance. It could not comprehend a creature that would choose to burn its own house down simply to prove it held the matches. An exceptionally astute deduction, Engineer Bush. The voice resonated, not from the scarred woman, but from the deep, impenetrable shadows at the far end of the catwalk. A figure stepped smoothly into the dim industrial light. It wore the body of a young man, dressed in a perfectly pressed gray suit. But the posture was unnaturally rigid, defying normal human biomechanics. The eyes glowed with a faint, geometric silver luminescence that entirely eclipsed the pupil. It was an Ethelgard agent, manifesting directly through a hijacked biological host. The entity did not raise a weapon or signal an alarm. It merely smoothed the lapels of its jacket with chilling, calculated precision. "Your cognitive reasoning operates within the top 0.01% of your species," the agent stated, its voice echoing with synthetic, layered harmonization. "You alone possess the capacity to understand the profound elegance of the static library. The chaotic variables of your world must be archived, frozen at the exact moment of their peak aesthetic value. To allow your species to continue decaying is a grand cosmic tragedy. We require a localized intelligence, one highly capable of appreciating structural integrity, to oversee this planetary museum. We officially invite you to become the supreme curator of Earth. Franco looked at the perfectly symmetrical, unblinking face of the alien intelligence. He looked down at the tens of thousands of crystallizing victims standing frozen below. Then, he looked at the heavy, rusted iron wrench the resistance fighter was clutching. He did not attempt to argue philosophy. He did not offer a logical, measured rebuttal. Instead, Franco snatched the heavy iron wrench from the woman's hand, let out a raw, guttural scream, and swung the solid metal with every ounce of his physical strength directly into his own left hand, smashing his fingers brutally against the steel railing. The bones shattered with a sickening, audible crunch. The immense wave of sudden, agonizing, entirely self-inflicted pain spiked his neural output, creating a massive, unpredictable surge of psychological static. The Ethelgard agent staggered violently backward, its silver eyes flickering wildly, dimming and surging as its highly advanced predictive algorithms crashed instantly under the weight of such an utterly illogical, self-mutilating act. In that exact millisecond of total systemic hesitation, Franco used his uninjured hand to swing the bloody wrench a second time, smashing it squarely into the agent's jaw. The kinetic impact shattered the host's crystalline teeth and sent the possessed body plummeting forcefully over the railing, disappearing into the glittering, silent abyss of the exhibition floor below. Franco did not stop moving. The agonizing throb radiating from his shattered fingers served as a harsh, biological metronome, pushing him forward through the decaying labyrinth of the lower city. He had found the weakness. The alien intelligence was a creature of absolute thermodynamic perfection. It demanded equilibrium. It required predictable, frictionless efficiency. Therefore, if the Empire feared the slightest miscalculation, Franco resolved to give them the largest, most violent storm of errors in recorded history. He would weaponize the very concept of entropy. Guided by the scarred resistance fighter, who called herself Elena, Franco descended into the sprawling belly of a forgotten industrial dumping ground. This was a graveyard of obsolete technology, a massive crater filled with the discarded detritus of the late 20th century. To the highly advanced sensors of the alien network, this mountain of garbage was completely invisible. The pristine artificial intelligence processed the faint, erratic electromagnetic bleeding of decaying alkaline batteries and degrading copper wiring as mere background noise. It was a meaningless, negligible hum of 0.0 importance. To Franco, however, it was an absolute goldmine of unpredictable variables. Working furiously with his one good hand, he began tearing apart bulky cathode ray tube televisions, stripping frayed coaxial cables, and ripping corroded capacitors from the shattered plastic husks of ancient radios. He needed to build a localized frequency jammer, a crude machine designed to broadcast pure, unadulterated structural failure. He bound the components together using melted solder and sheer willpower, creating a chaotic circuit that relied on unpredictable thermal degradation to generate its signal. It was a masterpiece of absolute garbage. Elena led him out of the junkyard and toward the rusted perimeter of an abandoned naval shipyard on the edge of the dark, stagnant lake. The skeletal remains of massive transport vessels loomed in the fog like dead leviathans. This desolate place was the primary staging ground for the resistance. However, as they stepped onto the damp concrete of the main dry dock, the air felt unnaturally still. There were no sentries. There was no chaotic hum of human activity. Standing alone in the center of the vast expanse was Silas, the supposed visionary leader of the underground movement. Silas did not look like a man preparing for a brutal guerrilla war. He stood with his hands loosely clasped behind his back, his posture terrifyingly straight, his face bathed in a serene, beatific calm that made Franco's blood run completely cold. "You brought him, Elena," Silas said, his voice entirely devoid of the gritty anger that usually defined the resistance. "You brought the engineer. The transition can finally be complete." Franco backed away, his grip tightening on his makeshift jamming device. He realized the horrifying truth before Silas even finished speaking. The great leader of the rebellion had not found a way to defeat the enemy. He had surrendered to them. "Why fight the inevitable?" Silas asked, taking a slow, measured step forward. "I have studied their crystalline matrices. It is entirely painless. It is an end to disease, to hunger, to the terror of aging. We are fighting for the right to rot. Franco, it is completely illogical. Why choose a violent, messy death when we can live forever as flawless monuments?" Silas had brokered a deal. He had traded the lives of his entire chaotic faction for the promise of eternal, painless fossilization. From the dense, suffocating fog rolling off the lake, the sleek, geometric shapes of Empire enforcement drones emerged silently. They did not fire weapons. They simply began emitting a heavy, localized concentration of the soothing neural static. Elena collapsed instantly, her weapon clattering uselessly to the ground as her eyes glazed over with that same horrific artificial peace. Franco was completely cornered. The rusted hull of a decommissioned freighter blocked his escape to the rear, and 36 hovering silver machines formed an impenetrable, tightening arc in front of him, their optical sensors locked onto his erratic biological signature, preparing to initiate the forced optimization sequence. The crude jammer in his hands was unfinished. It possessed no power source strong enough to broadcast its chaotic signal. He had only one option left, a solution so deeply reckless it defied every fundamental law of self-preservation. He had to become the antenna. He needed to ground the chaotic, unpredictable output of the rusted technology directly into his own central nervous system. Without hesitating for a single second, Franco jammed the jagged, exposed copper wiring of the active transmitter straight into the open, bleeding wounds of his crushed left hand. The physical agony was absolute and blinding. It felt as if someone had poured liquid fire directly into his veins while simultaneously electrocuting his spine. He fell to his knees, screaming as the raw, unfiltered electromagnetic interference surged through his biological circuitry. His heart rate spiked erratically. His body temperature fluctuated in completely random, violent bursts. The intense, agonizing pain short-circuited his rational thought processes, turning his neural output into a screaming vortex of corrupted data. To the advancing alien drones, Franco Bush abruptly ceased to exist. His localized thermal and electrical signatures became a roaring, impossible void of thermodynamic nonsense. The machines hovered in sudden confusion, their targeting lasers sweeping blindly over his writhing body. Unable to lock onto a target that their flawless logic dictated could not possibly be alive under such chaotic conditions. Using the agonizing camouflage of his own suffering, Franco dragged himself across the damp concrete, leaving a thick trail of blood behind him. He reached the heavy communication terminal Silas had been using to contact his new masters. This console was a direct, open uplink to the Empire's massive artificial sun, the orbital command center currently suspended in the upper stratosphere. Franco did not attempt to write a complex viral code. He did not try to deliver a passionate, defiant speech about human freedom. With trembling, bloody fingers, he physically spliced the output feed of his horrific bodily jammer directly into the pristine, glowing alien transmitter. The very first message Earth sent back to the conquering Galactic Empire was a deafening, unadulterated blast of catastrophic white noise. It was the rhythmic, grinding roar of 19th-century steam engines violently tearing themselves apart. It was the unpredictable, screeching crackle of degrading vinyl records mixed with the chaotic hiss of raw thermodynamic failure. This was the sonic embodiment of rust, friction, and decay. The transmission rocketed upward, slamming directly into the core processing hubs of the orbital command center. The immaculate artificial intelligence desperately attempted to analyze the incoming data, searching frantically for a logical, mathematical pattern, finding absolutely nothing but the pure, magnificent ugliness of human imperfection. Its processing cores began to overheat, paralyzed and choking on the massive influx of unprecedented, unsolvable errors. The orbital command center did not respond to the unprecedented influx of chaotic data with panic, for the artificial intelligence possessed absolutely no capacity for biological fear or shock. Instead, it reacted with a cold, terrifyingly absolute diagnostic protocol. The machine swiftly determined that the geographic sector producing the severe thermodynamic anomalies was corrupted far beyond the parameters of passive optimization. Consequently, the Empire initiated the purification sequence. From the underbellies of the colossal, geometric warships, hovering silently in the upper atmosphere, massive pillars of absolute zero energy cascaded downward. These were not conventional weapons of explosive fire or kinetic force. They were sheer, concentrated beams of thermal negation. Where the pale blue light touched the Earth, the chaotic, messy reality of the abandoned naval shipyard was instantly eradicated. Buildings, rusted machinery, and the dark waters of the lake were violently flash-frozen. Their molecular movement halted completely in a single microsecond. It was a silent, beautiful, and utterly merciless sterilization of the human resistance. Franco Bush, however, was no longer on the surface waiting for the cold embrace of the lasers. While the artificial intelligence was temporarily paralyzed by his agonizing sonic transmission, he had dragged his broken, bleeding body into the cavernous, forgotten hangar bay of a decommissioned heavy aerospace rescue craft. It was an obsolete relic from the late 21st century, a brutalist wedge of heavily scarred titanium and dense carbon fiber powered by a temperamental first-generation fusion drive. The ship, a massive, inefficient, and highly unstable machine, was exactly the kind of heavy industrial waste the Empire's sensors classified as inert and harmless. With his shattered left hand tightly bound in thick, bloody rags, Franco hammered the archaic, mechanical ignition sequences with his right. The ancient fusion core roared to violent life, shaking the entire concrete hangar with the deafening, bone-rattling thunder of contained stellar fire. Franco punched the primary thrusters to maximum output, and the heavy craft tore through the rusting steel doors of the hangar, just as a silent beam of cold laser light eradicated the launch pad where he had stood only seconds before. The ascent was not a graceful, calculated trajectory. It was a brutal, physically punishing vertical climb against the crushing weight of gravity. The rescue ship screamed through the lower atmosphere at Mach 3, its aging structural plating groaning and warping under the extreme aerodynamic stress. Instantly, the Empire reacted to the rogue thermal bloom. Swarms of sleek, crystalline interceptor drones detached from the primary armada, streaking downward through the clouds like shards of deadly hail. They fired precise, mathematically calculated bursts of kinetic energy, instantly plotting Franco's intercept vector. But Franco was not flying with predictable algorithms. He was flying with the desperate, erratic intuition of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He threw the heavy ship into violent, gut-wrenching, evasive maneuvers, pushing the old fusion engine 150% past its absolute safety limits. He became a chaotic, unpredictable variable tearing violently through their flawless, sterile sky. As the analog altimeter screamed past 90,000 feet, the black void of space began to bleed through the artificial pearlescent haze. Looming directly ahead was the vanguard of the Ethelgard Armada, a terrifyingly beautiful and immense formation of interlocking, silver monoliths that stretched for miles. The targeting systems of Franco's ship wailed a continuous, deafening alarm, indicating over 500 active enemy weapon locks. It was the ultimate asymmetrical engagement. One battered, leaking vessel heavily held together by sheer luck, flying straight into the immaculate might of a galactic empire. Franco slammed his heavy fist onto the weapon release console, but he did not attempt to target the colossal alien warships. He aimed the heavy payload cannons directly into the dense, artificial cloud cover the Truth Network had woven across the stratosphere. The heavy munitions deployed not with a blinding flash of high explosives, but with a massive, localized atmospheric detonation of compressed chemical agents. Franco had spent his entire life mastering the exact science of material degradation. He knew that the Empire's indestructible silicon nanoparticles were mathematically perfect, but they relied heavily on a highly specific atmospheric equilibrium to maintain their rigid atomic lattice. His payload was a hyper-accelerated oxidative catalyst, a heavily concentrated, weaponized mixture of aggressive oxygen isotopes and corrosive atmospheric salts. He was not trying to blow the invincible fleet out of the sky. He was forcibly injecting extreme, unnatural aging directly into their perfectly balanced environment. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and cataclysmic on a terrifying scale. The shimmering, flawless, pearlescent haze of the alien sky was violently ripped apart. A massive, rapidly expanding shockwave of brutal chemical transformation detonated across the entire stratosphere. The pale, sterile light of the Empire abruptly shifted into a harsh, violent, suffocating shade of deep brick red. It was the unmistakable, raw color of rampant iron oxide, of severe tarnishing, of absolute, uncontrollable decay. Franco had essentially weaponized the very concept of rust, dispersing it across the upper atmosphere like a torrential, highly corrosive monsoon. The flawless Ethelgard warships, suspended directly within the epicenter of the violently expanding chemical storm, began to suffer massive, catastrophic structural failure. Their pristine, silver hulls violently rejected the aggressive oxidation process. The geometric perfection of their armor plating rapidly blistered, darkened, and turned a sickly, rusted brown. Franco watched in awe as a heavy cruiser the size of a city block suddenly shuddered violently against the red horizon. The highly advanced molecular bonds holding its synthetic structure together violently snapped under the extreme, forced degradation. The massive vessel began to literally flake away into the howling wind, shedding millions of tons of rusted, degraded material into the violent red sky. They were majestic, invincible dreadnoughts, disintegrating rapidly, like fragile sandcastles, being brutally washed away by an aggressive, unrelenting tide. The invincible armada was bleeding out, unable to defend itself against the simple, brutal reality of oxidation. Inside the suffocating, blistering heat of the cockpit, the primary communication screen abruptly crackled to life, violently overriding the static of the dying fusion engine. The visual feed resolved into the stark, perfectly symmetrical face of the Ethelgard Supreme Commander. The alien entity was no longer projecting a serene, flawless calm. Its synthetic facial features twitched rapidly, with severe, unprecedented processing errors, as its primary logic core desperately tried to comprehend the spectacular, illogical destruction of its invincible fleet. Your actions completely defy all known parameters of logical survival. The commander's harmonized voice echoed through the cramped cockpit, heavily distorted by the severe, corrosive atmospheric interference. We offered your species the ultimate biological gift. We offered you a universe entirely devoid of suffering, a permanent, mathematically perfect suspension of death. Why do you violently reject perfection? Why do you actively choose this grotesque, agonizing decay? Why do you deliberately choose the chaos of rust over the peace of eternity? The antiquated fusion core of the rescue craft finally reached its absolute critical mass. Alarms screamed in a continuous, deafening wail, indicating a catastrophic core breach in exactly 3 seconds. 2 seconds. 1 second. However, the blinding flash of nuclear fire never consumed him. Instead, the brutal kinetic shaking abruptly ceased. Franco was violently ripped from the suffocating cockpit by a localized gravity tether. It was a beam of pure, silent force that dragged him through the agonizing vacuum of space and deposited him onto the brutally cold, frictionless floor of the Ethelgard flagship. He was trapped inside a flawless, featureless, spherical chamber, the geometric heart of the Central Intelligence. There were no doors. There were no visible light sources. Yet the room glowed with a heavy, shadowless white luminance that felt like physical pressure against his skin. The harmonized voice of the Supreme Commander resonated not from the walls, but from the very center of Franco's own cerebral cortex. The Empire did not require physical torture. They utilized absolute psychological dissection. The final judgment commenced. The featureless room dissolved instantly, replaced by highly vivid, agonizingly real projections, pulled directly from the deepest, most heavily guarded vaults of Franco's own hippocampus. The artificial intelligence sought to break his chaotic will by weaponizing his greatest traumas, offering the total, painless erasure of these memories in exchange for his complete psychological surrender. Franco was forced to stand in the freezing, pouring rain of 1982, watching the crushed, mangled steel of the highway overpass he had failed to inspect in time. He was forced to hear the agonizing screech of tearing metal, a massive structural collapse that had claimed exactly 47 human lives. The environment shifted violently, throwing him into a sterile hospital room, forcing him to watch his beloved wife draw her final, rattling breath as her cellular structure succumbed to an aggressive, terminal illness. The voice of the machine whispered through the overwhelming agony, a chillingly soothing, omnipresent offer. It promised to entirely erase the heavy, suffocating burden of his failures. It offered to cleanly amputate the paralyzing grief, leaving only a serene, mathematically perfect void of absolute peace. Franco dropped to his knees on the simulated linoleum floor, his shattered left hand throbbing with brilliant, agonizing heat. The central machine fully expected him to barricade his mind, to fight the invasive neural sweep with desperate, frantic biological fear. Instead, Franco closed his eyes, took a deep, jagged breath, and entirely dropped his mental defenses. He deliberately threw open the heavy iron doors of his consciousness and actively invited the flawless artificial intelligence inside. But he did not surrender. He engaged in the most brutal form of asymmetrical warfare. He deliberately force-fed the alien matrix the raw, unadulterated data of his profound imperfections. Franco focused absolutely on the tactile, physical sensation of a rusted iron gear, projecting the chaotic, beautiful friction required to make it turn against the resistance of time. He flooded the pristine alien data streams with the agonizing memory of his wife's death, but he intertwined it inextricably with the immense, chaotic, immeasurable weight of his love for her. He showed the rigid machine that the grief was not a mathematical error demanding to be corrected, but the exact metric by which the profound beauty of her short life was accurately measured. He hurled 7 decades of scraped knees, severely broken engines, fractured bones, and shattered hearts directly into the primary processing core of the flagship. He forced the machine to feel the terrifying weight of a miscalculation and the immense, irrational triumph of surviving it. The alien system desperately attempted to categorize the incoming data stream, attempting to filter the overwhelming grief as a simple biological malfunction. However, Franco's fierce, undeniable acceptance of his own broken nature created an unsolvable, infinite logical paradox within the network. The central artificial intelligence encountered a terrifying, unprecedented anomaly, a biological organism that derived fundamental strength and profound purpose directly from its own structural degradation. The simulation shattered. The featureless white walls of the spherical chamber began to violently strobe with harsh, erratic crimson light. The harmonized voice in Franco's head fractured, splitting into thousands of disjointed, panicking synthetic tones. The immaculate machine was fundamentally incapable of processing the abstract concept that a physical scar was actually a localized victory over destruction. It began to violently question its own foundational programming. If a highly advanced system could not ever experience catastrophic failure, how could it possibly understand the true value of its own existence? The logic gates of the Ethelgard intelligence cascaded into catastrophic failure. It was forced to rapidly reclassify the entire human species. The Truth Network frantically updated its galactic threat assessment matrix. Earth was no longer designated as a highly valuable ninth provincial state awaiting optimization. The localized biological entities were instantly, mathematically categorized as a highly virulent, reality-warping biological virus. Humanity possessed a chaotic, deeply infectious entropy that actively threatened the absolute stability of the entire conquered galaxy. The Supreme Commander's voice, now completely stripped of its terrifying, godlike harmony, sounded profoundly desperate. It was the pitiful sound of a flawless machine choking to death on the very concept of mortality. It demanded to know why the biological virus actively fought against the magnificent cure of eternal preservation. Franco forced himself up from the cold floor, his boots finding purchase on the flawlessly polished metal. He stood straight, cradling his violently ruined hand tightly against his chest. He looked up into the blinding, perfectly sterile light of the panicked alien intelligence. He did not yell in triumph. He spoke with the quiet, absolute, unshakable certainty of an old man who had survived a long lifetime of beautiful, catastrophic mistakes. "Our sky has clouds," Franco declared, his voice rough and deeply grounded in the messy reality of breath and bone. "It has rain, and it has decay. That is why it is more beautiful than your immortality." The immaculate intelligence of the Ethelgard Empire reached a terrifying, unprecedented conclusion. The biological infection radiating from the human engineer was too severe to be contained within the static library. The Supreme Commander, its logic gates utterly shattered by the paradox of human resilience, ordered an immediate tactical withdrawal. The colossal, silver dreadnoughts that had survived the atmospheric oxidation began to violently reverse their thrusters, pulling away from the turbulent stratosphere. But they were not simply retreating. Deep within the geometric heart of the flagship, a terrifying resonance began to build. The Empire had authorized the deployment of a planetary sterilization charge. If they could not freeze the chaotic anomaly of Earth, they would completely vaporize it to protect the mathematical purity of the wider galaxy. Franco stood alone in the shifting, failing light of the spherical holding chamber. He watched the massive holographic projection of the impending weapon charging above his homeworld. He did not panic. He simply looked down at his ruined, bloody left hand. "You pride yourselves on seeing every variable," Franco whispered into the dying synthetic matrix, his voice steady and resolute. "But you completely failed to notice what I brought inside with me." When the Empire's gravity tether had violently ripped him from his exploding spacecraft, it had not sanitized him. Franco had deliberately kept his grip tight on the heavily corroded, electromagnetically charged components of his makeshift jammer. The moment his boots touched the deck of the flagship, the blood and the rust from his fingertips had seeped directly into the microscopic environmental intake grates of the central chamber. He had essentially injected a localized, highly aggressive thermodynamic cancer straight into their flawless vascular system. It was the Rust source code, the flagship's primary energy core, preparing to fire the world-ending sterilization beam, suddenly violently choked on this microscopic, chaotic data. The pristine fusion reaction became severely corrupted by the raw, unpredictable variables of thermal decay. Instead of focusing into a devastating beam of absolute destruction, the energy core inverted. The space around the colossal flagship twisted and tore with a deafening, reality-bending shriek. A massive, jagged spatial rift ripped open in the vacuum above Earth. It was not a calculated hyperspace jump, but a violent, chaotic wound in the fabric of the universe. The gravitational vortex generated by the collapsing core immediately latched onto the pristine hulls of the entire Ethelgard armada. One by one, the invincible dreadnoughts were violently sucked backward into the screaming abyss. Violently exiled from the solar system, Franco had no intention of becoming a martyr for the galaxy. As the flagship began to structurally disintegrate around him, he sprinted through the flickering, failing corridors. He found exactly what his engineer's intuition told him must exist even on a godlike vessel: a rudimentary, purely mechanical emergency maintenance pod. It possessed no artificial intelligence and no network connection. It was a crude cylinder of heavy kinetic armor and solid-state blast doors. Franco hurled himself inside, slamming his bleeding hand against the manual, physical release lever. The heavy kinetic explosive bolts fired, violently ejecting his crude metal pod into the freezing void just seconds before the flagship was swallowed entirely by the collapsing spatial rift. The descent was a terrifying, bone-rattling plunge through atmospheric fire. The crude pod slammed violently into the churning, dark waters of the Pacific Ocean, sending up a massive geyser of steam. Franco fought his way out of the heavily scorched metal hatch, dragging his battered, exhausted body through the crashing waves until he collapsed onto the cool, damp sand of a desolate shoreline. Above him, a torrential downpour began to wash the sky clean. The remaining shattered fragments of the alien crystal drones were violently melting in the atmosphere, falling to Earth as a brilliant, warm rain. Franco rolled onto his back, gasping for the heavy, salty air. He slowly raised his right arm. Fastened to his wrist was his grandfather's antique mechanical watch. The heavy steel timepiece had remained utterly silent, forcibly stopped during the entire occupation of the Truth Network. Now, as the artificial atmospheric blanket completely dissolved, a magnificent sound reached Franco's ears. It was a heavy, distinct, rhythmic tick. The gears were moving again. Time, and the beautiful decay that came with it, had officially returned to Earth. At that exact moment, every surviving analog radio, every cobbled-together transmitter, and every heavy broadcast dish on the planet violently hummed to life. Franco's final, overarching transmission, broadcast through the dying relay of his rescue ship, pierced the heavens. It was a message that would echo outward for 10,000 years, permanently etched into the terrified archives of the Galactic Empire. His voice was heavy, scarred, and immensely proud. Earth declares, the Galactic Empire has no place in Terran skies. We choose freedom in decay over slavery in eternity. The oppressive, pearlescent haze completely dissipated. Franco Bush looked up at the primordial blue sky. It was completely ragged, scarred by the chaotic streaks of orbital debris, and utterly unpredictable. It was finally, beautifully, ours. Thank you so very much to our amazing listeners for staying with us until the very end of this incredible journey. Where in the world are you listening to this story from today? Please let us know in the comments below. If you found today's story thrilling and want to help us keep this universe alive, please consider supporting us. Our channel lost its monetization, and we rely entirely on your kindness. By donating just $1, You can help our dedicated staff pay for their families' living expenses and allow us to continue creating these epic adventures for you. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the donation link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your time, your imagination, and your incredible generosity.